Hello and welcome to the Broken Sword. Today we are looking at what happened in Numenor during the Second Age.
Build me an army worthy of Mordor.
This past week, Amazon have finally started to release something official for their Lord of the Rings on Prime show, which, and I would be shocked if you had not seen it, is an awesome teaser showing some things people were unlikely to have expected. But anyway, what this also means is that we also have a release date for the show, being September the 2nd, 2022. Therefore, we only just have over a year until the show comes out, which means over the next year things will be gaining more and more momentum as time goes on. So, to me, it kind of only made sense to go over just one thing for you all today, and that is, what happened in the land of Numenor during the Second Age of Middle-earth. There may well be plenty of you out there who know very little about this island, so let's have a look at its history. There is only one place to start, and that is with its founding. After all, and this may be a shocker for some people, the island of Numenor did not exist in the First Age. So, just how did it come to be? Well, during the First Age, the group of men known as the Edain took part in the war against Morgoth, and these Edain were those noble men who crossed into Beleriand to fight alongside the elves in that war. After victory was achieved, they were rewarded for their help. And this reward was not just from anyone. None other than the Lord of the Waters, the Valar Ulmo, rose an island out of the great sea that lay between Middle-earth and Aman. This kingdom would be named Numenor in the common speech, with the island itself being named Elendil, meaning starwards, as it was by the light of the star of Elendil that they were led to it, as well as its shape resembling that of a star as well. The kingdom of Numenor took this shape of a 5-pointed star, with each point having its own distinct feature, and so each of these had their own name. These were Forastar in the Northlands, Andustar in the Westlands, Hjarnustar in the Southwestlands, Hjarostar in the Southeastlands, Orastar in the Eastland, and there was also a central region too, with that one being named Mittalmar. In the very centre of this region stood the holy mountain of Meneltarma, and it is here where there would be a great temple built in tribute to Iluvatar, and the great eagles of Manwë would fly to this spot as well. Also, within these regions, each one had their own major city, and these were Armenelos in Mittalmar, Nindamos in Hjarostar, Aldalonde in Andustar, as well as Anduine and Almeida in Andustar. And finally, in regards to the geography of this land, there were also only 2 rivers to run through the island, and these were named Cyril and Nunduine. So now that the island existed, it was the year 32 of the Second Age that the first ships of the Edain landed on its shores. And who led these men? None other than Elros, twin brother of Elrond of Rivendell and the son of Elendil. This half-elf would become the first king of Numenor, and upon his coronation he would take the name of Tar Miniatur, which means the first king. It was around 50 years before the majority of the Edain finally made their way to the island, and over time them and their descendants became known as the kingly race of men we all know and love called the Numenoreans. In fact, something that assisted them was that the elves of Tolaresia would visit the island, bringing with them gifts and knowledge that helped advance this group of men. And for those interested, these Tolaresia elves were a group that moved to the blessed realm of Aman at the end of the First Age after the wars against Morgoth to reside there instead. Now, one of these main gifts that they received was a seedling from Celeborn. And no, not the elf, but Celeborn was actually the name for the white tree that grew in their lands, and this seedling from the white tree of Tolaresia would in fact be the one that would eventually supply the seedling that was carried to Middle-earth and in time grow to the white tree of Minas Ithil and then later Minas Tirith. The years would now pass and the men of Numenor were told to follow a simple rule: do not sail west, or at least so far west that Numenor would no longer be visible. The Valar forbade this, for they feared that these men would come to the Undying Lands, which is somewhere that they were just simply not allowed to visit. However, as the race of men tend to do, they became restless and wished to sail. So, as they could not go west, instead they went east, back in the direction of Middle-earth. When time reached the year 600 of the Second Age, it finally became too much to wait, and at last they decided to leave their own shores. And when they arrived, they landed in the region of Lindon, and that was through the path of the Gulf of Lune. Here they were greeted by the Elven King and High King of the Noldor, Gil-galad, and this was where one of the greatest alliances in the histories of Middle-earth had its foundation set. While they were here, the Numenoreans also made contact with the men of Eriador, also known as the Middlemen, and these were related through their ancestors to those that made up the Edain. Here they would pass on the knowledge that had been passed on to them, teaching them to improve their abilities in crafting and giving them the necessary skills to free themselves of the darkness that had kept them down for hundreds of years. By the time of the year 750, the Numenoreans were getting more and more comfortable with sailing, and here the son of the then king Tar-Meneldur, named Aldarion, set up the Guild of Venturers. He would even find a harbour called Vignalonde at the mouth of the Gwathlo. Although initially the people of these lands had no issues with the arrival of the Numenoreans, their peace with it all was very much tested when the members of the Guild of Venturers began cutting down larger and larger sections of their forests. This deforestation caused ever-growing tensions between the groups of people, but their rebellion here would be useless in the long run, as this settlement and harbour would survive into the times of the Third Age. But anyway, back to Numenor. Little more happened for the next 100 years, that is until we reach 882, when the king, still Tar-Meneldur at this time, receives a letter from Gil-galad. He receives warning that there is a new shadow rising in the east, and Gil-galad is sure that this is a servant of Morgoth, who is at the root of all of it. Gil-galad asks that when the time comes, the men of Numenor will send aid in support. However, Tar-Meneldur was not confident in his own wisdom. He does not believe that he will definitely do the right thing when that time comes. But there is someone that he trusts more: his son, Aldarion. Therefore, the king decided to resign the scepter and pass it down to his son. After all, Aldarion had spent a lot of time in Middle-earth already when he had been travelling on the seas. And for those of you who are not sure from what I just mentioned, the scepter is what the kings and queens of Numenor used as their symbol of rule, as opposed to using the usual symbol of a crown. With this changing of king, the now Tar Aldarion travelled back once more to Middle-earth to answer Gil-galad's call, while the men back in Numenor began preparations for war themselves. War would not come quickly though, and this gave them the time to establish settlements instead. So over the next few hundred years, the Numenoreans managed to set up havens and forts in preparation for the oncoming assault. The full invasion would be launched by Sauron in the year 1695, but in the years before there were smaller attempts to ruin the Numenorean settlements, as they were not fully armed before this point. But this was unsuccessful, as they still managed to hold strong throughout these times. When it did reach the year that Sauron launched his attack, Gil-galad sent word to Numenor and their king, now Tar-Ministir, as he had said he would, requesting support. However, it still took years before their navy could come and support. 5 years to be precise. Although most of Eriador had been overrun and ruined by then, when the true force of Numenor finally teamed up with the remaining Elven force, they managed to defeat Sauron in the battle known as the Battle of the Gwathlo, and this for at least a time reinstated peace into these lands. This victory would prove to be pivotal to the future of Numenor, although just how would not be obvious straight away. The Numenoreans had revealed just how powerful a force they were with their hand in the conclusion of the War of the Elves and Sauron. This caused a growing ego within their people. They became ever prouder and grew greater desire for wealth and even more power again. Greed was becoming their new enemy. Their naval force was so powerful that no one could dream to challenge it, and this meant that they would even go on to create more settlements on the shores of Middle-earth, whether the previous occupants wanted it or not. They would come to demand tributes from the people that they now ruled over. They oppressed them, but they were so blind to what they were doing that the Numenoreans had convinced themselves that they were simply liberating these people, not oppressing them. This growing ego would cause them to question other things as well, and mainly the ban of the Valar that they had suffered, as they grew ever more envious of the immortality of the Eldar and ever resentful for the gift of men. This would only ever grow as the years continued, and so by the time of the King Tar-Kiriatan, who began his rule in 1869 and would be the 12th King of Numenor, he would attempt to gain some form of immortality through the vast riches and highly decorated tombs that he introduced. This would also be continued by his son Tar-Atanamir, who began his rule in 2029, except that he would go even further, in the sense of starting to speak more openly against the Valar, and many Numenorians agreed with what he said and taught. This would cause a division in Numenor, with a split growing in the kingdom. And then, by the time of his son, Tar-Ankalimon, who began his rule in 2221, there would be a decisive split of two factions. One of these would be called the Kingsmen, and these were the Numenorians who stayed faithful to the king and no longer wished to abide by the Elven customs and languages. And the other group were known as the Faithful, and these were the ones who refused to change their path and remained loyal to the Elves and the Valar. The King's men would attempt to extend their power into Middle-earth over the next period, and by 2280 they had fortified Umbar, and they used this position to take over Harad and extend their dominions further south. It was reaching the point that even Sauron was growing wary of them, despite hiding in these same lands. Whereas the Faithful decided to build their own harbour city called Pelagia on the great river Anduin, setting up what would be the foundations for Gondor. But what about back on Numenor itself? Well, by the year 2899, the line of the kings was now up to its 20th king. This one named Ar-Adunakor. When he was first born, most people of Numenor were no longer using the Elven tongues, so he was the first king to break with the tradition of taking their royal name in Quenya, instead taking his title in Andunaic, which is the name of the Numenorean language, meaning language of the West. And his name was also blasphemous, since its very meaning signified Lord of the West, which obviously insulted the Valar, or more specifically Manwë himself. It was seen as a direct challenge to the lordship of the Valar, and the faithful Numenorians considered it ill-omened. So it is also to no surprise that during his reign he began the persecution of those faithfuls that would attempt to speak openly, with it even reaching the point that no elf would again sail to the island in any public manner. Despite this being a truly testing time for the faithful of Numenor, they did not all leave the lands, and the faithful would remain in the port city of Andunier. But they would not be left alone, for by the time of Ar-Gimilzor, who began his rule in 3102, the faithful would be forced to relocate to Romena, the main seaport of Numenor, except here the king closed off any access to elven visitors. It reached the point that many would now give up with living on Numenor and leave in secret to Middle-earth, so that they could remain amongst the Eldar instead. Once Ar-Gimilzor's time came to an end, his son Tar-Palantir became king in 3177, and here things began to change even more, and this was due to his mother, as, in secret, she was a member of the Faithful and taught her son to be an elf friend. And so, under his reign there was an attempt to push back the jealousy and rebuild bridges with the elves and the Valar. However, these bridges had been burned so badly that he could not accomplish it in his lifetime. It was this king who made the prophecy that when the White Tree would die, it would also be when the line of the kings would fail. Tar-Palantir did not go unopposed during his time though, and his biggest challenger was in fact his brother, Gimilcat. His brother had taken after his father in his beliefs, so he was always vocal in his opposition to his brother, and he would then have a son named Ar-Pharazon, who would come into play a major role in things to come. For Pharazon was a mighty warrior who spent many years fighting away from the lands of Numenor with the aims to extend the reach of Numenor's hold in Middle-earth. However, in the year 3243, the news of his father's passing would reach him, and so he would return to Numenor and take over the leadership of the King's Men, and then raised a rebellion against his uncle. When Tar-Palantir died in 3255, he had no sons, only a daughter named Miriel. She was in line to succeed her father, but Pharazon usurped the scepter and forced her into marriage, and this was not just against her will, but against the laws of Numenor as well, as here, Numenor had prohibited first cousins from marrying. But nonetheless it happened, and he proclaimed himself now Ar-Pharazon the Golden, and changed the name of Miriel to Ar-Zimrafel. For a few years Ar-Pharazon remained in Numenor, and that is until the year 3261, when he would sail back to Middle-earth once more, this time to take down the re-emerging threat of Sauron. His force struck fear into the heart of Sauron, and so Sauron surrendered to the might of this army, so Ar-Pharazon took him back to Numenor as a hostage. At this point, a group of Numenoreans, the Druidain, decided now was truly the time to leave Numenor once and for all. And this turned out to be a wise move, for Sauron would work his way up from hostage all the way up to the advisor of the king through his twisted words. He would promise the Numenoreans eternal life if they promised to worship Malkor in return, and their wish for immortality clouded their judgment. Ar-Pharazon would come to build a 500-foot tall temple in tribute to Malkor, where acts like human sacrifice would take place. They surely now had moved so far away from the people that were once given their own island as a reward for fighting against Malkor. This was not all that happened during this time though. As mentioned before in Warning, the White Tree, Nimloth the Fair, was chopped down and burnt, also in sacrifice to Malkor. Here, at risk to his own life, a name you all may recognise appears, for Isildur would rescue a fruit of the tree, preserving it for the future. Sauron would weave his words into the mind of Ar-Pharazon more and more, and by the year 3319, after preying on the king's fears of death and old age, he would be persuaded to build a great fleet of ships with the intention of sailing to a man, declaring war on the Valar, and taking the Undying Lands for themselves. The Valar were aware of these goings-on though, and they even attempted to warn these men off this foolish assault by sending a warning in the form of giant eagles. But these were utterly ignored. Therefore, Ar-Pharazon and his army landed on the shores of Aman in this year. The Valar were stuck with what to do though, for they were forbidden from killing or using any force against men, but they were wary of what damage that they could do to Valinor, and so the Valar would ask for assistance from none other than Iluvatar, and Iluvatar answered. This is the moment in the histories where the world would be broken, moved, and changed from flat to round, and Aman, along with Tol Eressëa, were taken away from the world forever. Iluvatar would open up a chasm in the sea, and this would swallow the entire fleet whole. Along with this, Numenor too was swallowed by the sea, being sunk into the abyss, killing everyone who was on it. Or nearly everyone, for there was only one who would survive after still being on Numenor when the waves hit, and that was Sauron. Although the effort it took to survive did weaken the Dark Lord dramatically, for it robbed him of his ability to take on a fair physical form, or in fact, to change form at all. You may be wondering here though, how did Isildur survive then? Well, his father and the leader of the faithful at this time, Elendil, had foreseen the disaster that was incoming, and he took his sons and followers off in 9 ships before the island was completely taken away. Then from here they would sail to Middle-earth, gather the surviving Numenoreans, and go on to found the kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor. And so, in the year 3319, Numenor would cease to exist. They had gone from not existing at all in the First Age, to becoming one of the most powerful realms in the Second Age, and then to a land that Iluvatar would step in and destroy by the end of it, all down to their jealousy and corruption. It will definitely be interesting to see how this story will be told in the upcoming Amazon show, including anything I may have potentially either missed or where they may add things to fill in the gaps where there is no information at all. After all, this land of Numenor is going to be such a central part to the Lord of the Rings on Prime show from what we can tell. This was one of their very first teasers that they ever released, obviously being the map of Numenor. So that makes me curious here, and this is where I want to ask you the question of the day, and that is, are there any parts of its history that you have heard here today that you hope that they either definitely include or definitely miss out from telling? Or even, how do you feel about if they fill in some of the gaps with their own story as well, especially if it doesn't affect the grander story that is told? Let me know all of your thoughts and opinions on this subject in the comment section below. And now that we have reached the end of the video, of course I want to remind you we do not just have this channel but two others, and they are the 6th Ranger for Power Rangers content and History of Dragon Ball for Dragon Ball content. Links for both of those channels will of course be in the description below if you would like to go over and check them out. And now to finish off, it's time to shout out our patrons. Firstly, our Divine Power team members of Kevin, Abram, Matt and Glorfindel of Gondolin. You are all awesome. And a big thanks to our Fire Demon team members of Nishith, Denver Steel and Gregory. And as well, I cannot forget the Wizard Staff team members of John, Andrew, Pirate747 and Charlie Thomas to go with them. Every single one of you is a true legend of the Brohirrim. And finally, if you have not already as well, please do all the great stuff. Hit that like button if you enjoyed the video. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content from us. And why not leave a comment too in response to my question or something else entirely, I do not mind. It is just great to hear from every single one of you. And so, thank you if you have managed to reach the very end of this video with me today, and I will see you next time on The Broken Sword.